He took my arm and led me to the next room. The king was lying on the floor. His face was red, and he was breathing heavily. "We've been trying to wake him up for half an hour, but we can't," explained Fritz. I bent down and felt his pulse, which was very weak and slow. "It must have been those cakes that he ate last night. Do you think he was poisoned?" I asked. "We don't know," said Sapt. "We must get a doctor." "There's no doctor for 15 kilometers, and even 1,000 doctors won't make him better today," said Fritz. "But what about the coronation?" I cried. "We must tell the people of Ruritania that he's ill," said Fritz. "If he's not crowned today, I don't think he'll ever be king," said Sapt. "But why?" I asked. "The whole country's waiting for him today. Most of the army is waiting too, with Duke Michael leading it. They won't be happy," said Sapt. "We must tell everyone what's happened and make the most of it," said Fritz, getting up to leave. Sapt stopped him. "Do you think that he was poisoned?" he asked me. "Yes, I do," I answered. "Then who did it?" "It must have been Duke Michael," Fritz said angrily. "Yes, he did this so that his brother cannot be crowned," continued Sapt. "You don't know what the Duke is like, do you, Razendil? If Rudolph doesn't become king, Duke Michael will take the crown." We all sat in silence while we thought about what we could do. Then Sapt suddenly stood up. "I have an idea." "It was lucky that we met you yesterday," he said excitedly, looking at me, "because you can go to Struslau to be crowned. Me? That's impossible," I laughed. "People would realize that I'm not the king. And don't forget that I'm English." "It would be easy to forget that," said Fritz, "because your German's perfect. And if we dress you in different clothes, no one will know." "If you don't go to Strusau, Duke Michael will be king tonight, and the king will either be dead or in prison," said Sapt. "I understand what you are saying, but the king would never forgive me if I—" "Our country needs this," cried Sapt. Standing up, I walked round the room in silence. The clock ticked 60 times, then 70, 80. I looked at the poor king lying on the floor and realized I had no choice. Sapt clearly read my expression, because he smiled even before I said quietly, "Very well, I'll go." "We won't wait for Michael's guards but leave for Strusau at once," said Sapt. "We can hide the king in the cellar, so when the guards arrive, they'll think no one else here," said Sapt. "What if they search the building?" asked Fritz. "Joseph will say the hunting lodge is empty," said Sapt. "This is our only chance." "How will we get the king to Strusau?" I asked. "Tonight we sleep in the palace," said Sapt. "As soon as we are alone in the king's bedroom, you and I will leave and come back here on our horses. Fritz can stay and guard the king's bedroom in the palace, and I will tell Joseph to get the king ready for the journey back. The king will then return to the palace with me in the dark. Meanwhile, you will ride as fast as you can to the border and try to leave the country before it's light. Do we all agree on this plan? I agree, I said. It's a good plan, said Fritz. Sapt and Fritz picked up the king and began to carry him out of the room. But we realized we were being watched by Johan's mother, who looked at us with a strange expression before walking off. I think she heard us, said Sapt. After we've moved the king, I'll speak to her. Meanwhile, Joseph began to dress me in some of the king's clothes. When Fritz returned, he looked at me and said, "You know, I think we can do this." What happened to Johan's mother? I asked. She's locked in the cellar with the king, said Fritz. Joseph will let her out later, after Michael's gone. But I'm sure when they find that the king is not here, Michael will realize we know about his plan. Let's go, said Sapt, returning into the room. Is all safe here? Asked Fritz. No, nothing's safe anywhere, but we must do our best, answered Sapt. We were now all in uniforms and set off on horses. It was a cool morning, and Sapt immediately began to tell me the history of the king's life, of his family, likes, interests, weaknesses, friends, and servants. He told me how I should behave in the palace and said he would always be at my side to tell me who the people were that I met. Soon we reached the station. Fritz told the surprised-looking station guard that the king had changed his plans, and we got on the train to the capital. I looked at my watch, or I should say the king's watch, and asked Fritz if he thought Duke Michael had found the king. I hope not, said Fritz. After a short time, we passed the towers and buildings of the capital, and I could see we were near the station. How are you feeling? Asked Sapt. Nervous, I replied. I'm not made of stone, you know. You'll be fine, but we are an hour earlier than expected, so there will be no one to meet us. We must send word to the palace. So meanwhile, I'll have some breakfast, I cried. The king is hungry. Sapt smiled at me, then took my hand. Let's hope we're all alive tonight. The train stopped, and I breathed deeply as we stepped out onto the station at Strelsau. A moment later, and everything was suddenly busy. Men ran up to us, then ran away again. Soldiers rode off on horses. Other men showed me to the station restaurant. As I ate my breakfast, I could hear music and people cheering, "God save the king," in preparation for the coronation. God save both kings, said Sapt. When we left the restaurant, we saw that a group of soldiers had arrived to welcome us. It was led by a tall, old man whose jacket was covered in medals. That is Marshal Strakinch, said Sapt, so that I knew who he was. A very important person in the army. The marshal greeted me and said he was sorry that the Duke could not meet me at the station, but that he would see me shortly. I answered as politely and formally as I could, and began to feel less nervous when no one seemed to realize that I was not the real king. But I saw that Fritz was still very nervous when he shook the marshal's hand. The soldiers led us out of the station. where we got onto horses that were waiting outside. I began to ride through the capital with the marshal on my right and Sapt on my left. As we were riding, I saw that the city was partly old and partly new. There were wide, modern streets where the rich people lived in big houses. These were the people who had always lived well under the king's father, and who support the new king because they knew that nothing would change. But behind the modern streets was a very different area that made up the old town. Here, thousands of people were crowded into tiny houses which were old and hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter. These narrow streets were where the city's many poor people lived, and these people did not want things to stay the same. For that reason, they did not like the king and supported Duke Michael, who told them he wanted things to be different and gave them hope for a better future. I knew that this area would not be very safe for me, the king. We continued towards a great square where the palace stood. There were colored flags and colorful ribbons everywhere, and people lined the streets clapping and cheering. I waved to them as we passed, and people threw flowers down from balconies above me. One flower fell on my horse, so I picked it up and stuck it onto my coat. Seeing me do this, the marshal looked at me, but I could not tell from his expression whether he was happy or angry. Nevertheless, I smiled happily at the marshal. I have written happily, but that is really how I felt. The truth is, at the moment, I really believed that I was actually the king. I looked up and laughed, delighted to see so much color and so many happy faces. Then I looked again in surprise. There, on a balcony above me, was the proud smile of the traveler on the train, Antoinette de Mauban. She stared at me. Her expression changed. Surely she knew who I was. Surely she would call out, "That is not the real king."